Our marriage wasn't perfect, but I loved my wife, Sarah. We had our rough patches, like any couple, but I'd always believed we could weather anything. She was my world, and even on the days when things got tense, I'd catch myself staring at her, feeling lucky to have her by my side. Then, one evening, Sarah came home, her face bright with a type of excitement I hadn't seen in a long time. She told me she'd been invited on a 3-day business trip to New York. I was surprised. She hadn't mentioned anything about travel plans, and her job rarely required trips like this, but I didn't think much of it at first. She was smart, driven, and dedicated, qualities that had drawn me to her in the first place. This seemed like a great opportunity for her, and I was happy for her success. But there was something off about her. I couldn't put my finger on it, but as she packed her bags the next day, a feeling of unease settled over me. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. But later that evening, as we sat together in the living room, I couldn't resist. "So, where exactly are you staying?" I asked casually, keeping my voice light. She hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but long enough to set off a warning bell in my mind. "A hotel near Central Park." "They haven't booked it yet," she replied, then quickly changed the topic, asking about my own weekend plans. But that slight pause, that barely noticeable flicker in her eyes, it stayed with me. After she'd gone to bed, I lay awake, her words circling in my mind. Something didn't feel right. I hated myself for thinking this way. Sarah had never given me a reason to doubt her, but that hesitation lingered like a splinter under my skin. As the clock struck midnight, I made a decision. I'd take the weekend off work and surprise her in New York. I told myself it was a romantic gesture. After all, what could be wrong with taking a break and spending a weekend together in the city? The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. We'd both been so busy, rarely seeing each other outside of rushed dinners or late-night conversations. Maybe this was what we needed. The next day, Sarah left early, kissing me goodbye with a lingering smile that somehow added to my unease. I watched her drive away, feeling like something was slipping out of my grasp. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to step into a different world. Once she was gone, I quickly packed a small bag, filled with an odd sense of excitement and anxiety, and caught the next flight to New York. I had no plan. I didn't even know what hotel she was staying at, but I told myself I'd figure it out. Sarah and I had been together for years. I knew her favorite places, her habits, the kind of spots she liked to visit. By the time I landed in New York, it was late afternoon. The city buzzed around me, alive with lights and noise, but I felt strangely detached. My mind focused on only one thing: finding Sarah. I started with her favorite hotel in Midtown, a place we'd stayed at once during an anniversary trip. But after an awkward conversation with the front desk, I learned she wasn't there. I checked another hotel nearby, then another. Nothing. With each stop, my unease grew, and doubts began creeping in. Was I overreacting? Was I actually making a fool of myself, running around the city searching for her like some jealous boyfriend? But just as I was about to give up, I saw her. She was walking down the street, laughing. Her arm looped through the arm of a man I didn't recognize. He was younger, maybe in his late 20s, tall and athletic, with a confident swagger that made my blood boil. I ducked behind a corner, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Sarah looked different. She was dressed in a way I hadn't seen in years, sleek and stylish, with a hint of something daring. She looked more alive than she had in a long time, and that realization was like a punch to the gut. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe this was just a colleague. Maybe she was simply enjoying a night out. But as I watched them, they paused outside a hotel, and she leaned into him, her lips brushing his in a way that left no doubt. This was no business trip. She was with him. The truth hit me like a cold slap, my entire body going numb. I stood frozen, staring as they entered the hotel together, her hand on his arm, a look of happiness on her face that I hadn't seen in so long. I wanted to burst through those doors, confront them right then and there. But something held me back. I felt humiliated, broken, a part of me refusing to believe this was happening. I turned away, stumbling down the street, my mind a whirlwind of anger and disbelief. The entire night, I wandered through the city, grappling with the reality I'd just uncovered. By the time the sun rose, I had only one thought left in my mind. I had to confront her. I needed to know why. The next evening, I returned to the hotel, my heart pounding as I approached the front desk. The lobby was busy, filled with travelers dragging suitcases and business people absorbed in their phones. But to me, the hotel felt cold and impersonal, its grand decor masking the hurt festering inside me. I approached the front desk, my palms clammy, my heart a steady drum in my chest. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'm looking for my wife. She's staying here on a business trip, but I think she may have checked in under her company's name. Her name is Sarah." The woman at the desk gave me a polite smile, her fingers tapping on the keyboard as she scanned through records. My stomach twisted as I waited, every second stretching unbearably long. "I'm sorry, sir," she finally said, looking up at me with an apologetic expression. "We don't have anyone by that name or associated with any recent business reservations." "Are you sure she's staying here?" I forced a nod, trying not to let my disappointment show. "Thank you," I mumbled, stepping away from the desk. It was a dead end. I hadn't anticipated the sheer difficulty of tracking her down, and I started to feel the weight of my own desperation. But I wasn't ready to give up. I moved toward the hotel bar, figuring I could sit there, watch the elevator bank, and hope for a glimpse of them. Maybe I'd catch them on their way down. Maybe I'd see them in the lobby. I didn't know. My pulse pounded, a low, constant thrum in my ears. Hours passed. I ordered a drink I didn't even touch, pretending to be interested in my phone while my eyes darted to the elevator every few minutes. Just as my patience was running thin, my breath hitched. I spotted her. She was descending the stairs from the second-floor mezzanine, her hand clasped around the arm of that same younger guy. They looked so casual together, like they were a couple without a care in the world, laughing at some private joke. She wore a dress I didn't recognize, one that hugged her curves in a way that made her look younger, radiant in a way I hadn't seen in years. The pain was visceral, a blow to the chest. I felt like a ghost, watching my own life unravel in front of me. But I couldn't stop myself. I got up and followed them, keeping a safe distance, like I was somehow a stranger in her life now, an outsider observing from the shadows. They exited through the hotel's side door, stepping into the cool night air. I followed, staying half a block behind as they strolled down the street. They were in no rush, laughing and stealing glances at each other, as if time itself had paused just for them. My heart hammered painfully as they turned into a smaller, more secluded hotel down the street. As soon as they were inside, I hesitated. I could still turn around. I could walk away, let it be, confront her later with some sense of composure. But I knew I wouldn't. I needed to see it for myself, no matter how much it might destroy me. I walked inside, following them just far enough to see them disappear down the hallway. Then I approached the front desk again, hoping that my facade of control would hide the turmoil roiling within me. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'm here to see my wife. She's staying here with a colleague." The woman behind the counter raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "Certainly, sir. What's her name?" "Sarah," I replied quickly, catching the nervous tremor in my own voice. "Sarah Williams." She typed briefly on her keyboard before glancing back up at me. "I'm afraid we can't provide room numbers for guests for privacy reasons, sir." I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my temper in check. "I understand," I replied, forcing a calm tone. "Could you at least let her know I'm here? I'd like to surprise her." The woman hesitated, eyeing me with something between sympathy and suspicion. "One moment, please," she said finally, picking up the phone. I waited, feeling my heart race, my pulse throbbing in my temples. She spoke in a low voice, too quiet for me to hear, and a moment later, she hung up. "I'll let her know," she said, her voice cool and professional. "If you'd like, you're welcome to wait here." I thanked her, turning away and heading toward a cluster of plush chairs near the lobby's windows. I sat, my gaze trained on the hall, every nerve in my body on edge. I didn't know what I'd do when she appeared, if she'd even come out. My mind spun with possibilities, each one more painful than the last. Then, suddenly, She was there, standing in the hallway. Her expression was blank with shock as she registered my presence. I watched the surprise flicker across her face, the unmistakable guilt that made my heart twist painfully in my chest. "Sarah," I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. "Care to explain why you're here with him?" Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She glanced down the hall, as though she were hoping he'd come to her rescue, but there was no one to bail her out. We were alone in this moment, and there was no hiding. "I didn't expect you to be here," she finally managed, her voice weak, as if that alone could explain away the betrayal, the lies, the distance that had crept between us like a wall. I took a step closer, the anger welling up as I spoke. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? That I'd never see this?" For a moment, she looked like she might cry, but instead, she straightened her shoulders, her gaze hardening. "This isn't what you think." "Then tell me," I demanded, my voice breaking. "Tell me what this is." But she was silent, her eyes dropping to the floor, the guilt playing on her face. And in that silence, everything I'd feared became painfully, irrevocably real. I thought the confrontation would give me some sense of closure, but it only made things worse. Sarah's evasions, her refusal to admit the truth, twisted my anger into something darker. I felt trapped in this limbo, caught between wanting answers and not knowing if I could stomach them. Each time I replayed the moment of finding her in that hotel, the image of her smile, her touch on that man's arm, it hit me all over again, a fresh stab of betrayal. The night after confronting her, I lay in the guest room, listening to the silence of the house. The empty space where Sarah should have been, the subtle absence of her warmth, it clawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, that her explanation about just needing space didn't even scratch the surface of what she'd been hiding. A few days later, I got my chance to find out more. I left work early, telling myself I just wanted to clear my head. But instead of going home, I went back to that hotel, hoping for, well, I wasn't sure what I hoped for. Clarity? An answer? Proof that I wasn't crazy? I asked the front desk if a woman named Sarah had recently checked in. I flashed my wedding ring, hoping it might win me a bit of sympathy, and the clerk's expression softened just enough to tell me she'd seen Sarah before. "I remember her," she said after a pause, giving me a quick, discreet look. "But she checked out early this morning, and she wasn't alone." My stomach dropped. I managed to keep my composure, thanked her, and walked out, but my mind was racing. She'd checked out without a word to me, without even a flimsy excuse. And she wasn't alone. I spent the next few days in a fog, going through the motions at work, putting on a mask of normalcy while my mind turned over every detail, every strange text message I'd ignored, every late night she'd been working. I was done letting her secrets simmer in silence. That evening, when I got home and found her sitting at the kitchen table, I didn't hold back. "Who is he, Sarah?" I asked, my voice barely holding together. She didn't answer right away, just glanced up with that same blank expression I'd seen at the hotel. "It's not what you think," she finally muttered, looking down at her hands. "Not what I think," I repeated, my anger rising again. "You're sneaking around New York with another man, lying to me, avoiding any kind of explanation, and you're saying it's not what I think. Then tell me, Sarah, what is it then?" Her face crumpled for a split second before she seemed to steel herself. "Look, I needed space. You don't understand how it's been for me. I haven't felt like myself in years." "Space? You're destroying everything we've built for some space? I want to know exactly what this is, who he is, and why you think I wouldn't find out." Her silence felt like confirmation, but then she looked at me, her eyes empty in a way that felt even worse than tears. "You never understood me, did you? You think love is just ownership, that I'm yours. But I'm not, and I never have been." Her words were a slap, but beneath them, I felt a familiar chill. This wasn't about some fling or even dissatisfaction in our marriage. This was something darker, something premeditated. As she spoke, her voice turned cold, almost indifferent. "You think you have it all figured out, don't you? But you don't know a thing about me. You never have." I didn't recognize the woman standing in front of me. My anger melted into something colder, resolve. I didn't care if she thought I didn't understand her. What I cared about was uncovering what she was really hiding. As she stormed out of the kitchen, retreating to the bedroom, I felt an impulse I couldn't ignore. I waited until the house was still, then I slipped into our shared office. Sarah was meticulous about her work and kept everything organized. Files, personal accounts, work records, all neatly filed in her laptop. I powered it up, half expecting a password change, but it was the same as always. And that's when I found the trail. A series of emails, cryptic but revealing, from a new account she'd created just a few months ago. They weren't addressed to anyone I knew, but to him. There were dozens of emails, each more explicit than the last, detailing their plans to leave, the hotels they'd stayed at, the financial arrangements she'd made. One line stopped me cold. The money should be fully transferred by the end of next month. We'll have everything we need to start over. The air left my lungs. Money. I scrolled further, dread twisting my stomach into knots. She'd been siphoning funds from our joint accounts, little by little, over the past year, all while I remained oblivious. She was planning to take everything I'd worked for, every bit of security, every hope we'd ever saved for, and disappear with him. A wave of betrayal crashed over me, mixing with a burning sense of humiliation. This wasn't just an affair. This was something calculated. I didn't have the full picture yet, but what I'd found was enough to fill in the blanks. As I sat there in the dark, the laptop's cold glow illuminating her deception, I knew there was no going back. This wasn't about forgiveness anymore. This was about survival. I would have to be careful, quiet, and just as calculated as she had been. But first, I needed to confront her, to see if she could keep up this charade knowing I had a piece of the truth. And then, when she least expected it, I'd turn her entire scheme back on her. The next morning, I watched Sarah as she moved around the kitchen, making coffee like everything was perfectly normal. The calmness with which she went about her day, while I now knew she was planning to betray me completely, nearly made me sick. The woman standing before me wasn't the Sarah I'd married, and I wasn't sure she ever had been. She had hidden this darker, conniving side so well that I'd believed every smile, every gesture, every kiss. But now, I was done pretending. The truth was bubbling just beneath the surface, and I wanted to see if she'd even flinch. "Did you have a good time on your business trip?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral as I stirred my own coffee. She froze for just a split second, her hand hovering over the coffee pot. "Yes," she said, her voice a little too bright. "It was a productive trip." A surge of anger twisted in my chest, but I held it back, forcing a smile. "That's good to hear. You seemed pretty comfortable with your colleague when I saw you two together." Her face drained of color. She turned toward me, her expression a mix of shock and defiance. "You followed me?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though I could hear the tremor beneath. "Yes," I replied, staring at her. "I followed you. I saw you with him." She swallowed hard, the mask slipping just enough to reveal a flicker of panic before she forced it back into place. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice softer, almost pleading. "I can explain." "Can you?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. "Can you explain why you've been siphoning money from our accounts, hiding transactions, and making plans with him behind my back?" The color drained from her face entirely, and for a moment, I thought she might break. But then, just as quickly, her expression hardened. "You went through my things?" she snapped, her voice cold and sharp. "You had no right." "No right?" I repeated, almost laughing. "You're talking about rights, Sarah, when you've been planning to take everything from me?" She took a deep breath, her gaze darting away. For the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes, and it was a strange sort of satisfaction. I wasn't going to take everything. I just needed an exit plan. An exit plan? I could hardly keep my voice steady, anger boiling just beneath the surface. "You didn't have the decency to just end things. No, you had to go behind my back, make a plan to take everything we built, and leave me with nothing." Her eyes flashed, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of the person she'd been hiding. "You wouldn't understand," she said, her voice laced with bitterness. "You never have." You were content with your routines, with our predictable little life. But I was suffocating. The words stung, but they were nothing compared to the betrayal. So that justifies ruining my life? Stealing from me? Running off with him? She laughed bitterly, the sound cold and hollow. You're acting like this is all my fault. Like you didn't play a part in this. My hands clenched at my sides, every nerve in my body tense. How exactly am I responsible for this, Sarah? She held my gaze, her expression defiant. You checked out years ago. You stopped paying attention. You stopped caring about who I was, about what I wanted. You only saw what you wanted to see. Maybe I stopped caring because I was too busy working to support us, to make sure we had a life together. I never thought I needed to look over my shoulder, to suspect you of something like this. Her silence spoke volumes. She was no longer trying to deny it. Instead, she met my gaze with something almost like pity, and it twisted in my gut. There was no remorse, no guilt, just a cold acceptance of what she'd done. What now? She asked finally, her voice barely a whisper. You found out everything. So what are you going to do? It was a question that had haunted me ever since I'd uncovered her plan, and until that moment, I hadn't fully decided. But now, looking into her eyes and seeing the person she truly was, my path became clear. I could report you, I said, keeping my voice calm. I could take all this to the police, let them see what you've been doing. I have enough proof to ruin you. She didn't flinch, just gave me a tired, resigned look. Then do it. If you're so righteous, go ahead. Destroy everything. The casual indifference in her tone set my blood boiling again, but I held it together. No, I said, leaning forward, my voice steady. I'm not going to ruin you. Not yet. I want you to know how it feels to lose everything slowly, just like I did. A flicker of doubt crossed her face, the first sign of uncertainty I'd seen. What does that mean? It means I'm going to take back everything you tried to steal. I've already spoken to the bank, frozen our joint accounts. I've transferred every last dollar into separate accounts. You have nothing left to take. The shock on her face was satisfying, and for a moment, I thought I'd finally broken through the mask. But then she smiled, a slow, chilling smile that sent a shiver down my spine. You think you've won, don't you? I know I have, I replied, my voice cold. Her gaze darkened, a sinister glint in her eyes. You have no idea what you've just set in motion. You might think you're in control, but you're wrong. Very wrong. With that, she turned on her heel and walked out, her footsteps echoing through the house, leaving me standing there, a chill creeping down my spine. I'd wanted to corner her, to show her she couldn't control me anymore. But her parting words left me shaken. She had another plan up her sleeve. And somehow, I knew this was only the beginning. The days after our confrontation passed in a tense silence. I thought I'd won, that stripping Sarah of her resources would force her to back down. But her parting words haunted me. You have no idea what you've just set in motion. The sinister glint in her eye, that mocking smirk. I couldn't shake it. It felt like a threat, one I couldn't quite decipher. The tension gnawed at me, keeping me on edge. I doubled down, determined to monitor every aspect of our lives, looking for any cracks Sarah might exploit. I checked our bank accounts daily, made sure our financial transactions were watertight, and even kept track of her phone calls as best as I could. But everything seemed quiet. She wasn't reaching out to her lover, not openly at least, and there were no suspicious withdrawals or secret plans. It was as though she'd backed off. Then, one night, I came home late from work. The house was dark, and the silence was heavier than usual. I walked through each room, tension mounting, calling for Sarah. There was no answer. Her car wasn't in the driveway, and when I checked her closet, half of her things were gone. She'd left, it seemed, without a word. A mix of relief and suspicion crept in. Had she finally given up? Had I won? Or was this part of a larger plan? My phone buzzed, breaking my thoughts. It was a message from an unknown number. Check your email. You're going to want to see this. The hairs on my neck stood up. My heart pounded as I rushed to my laptop and opened my email. There was a single message in my inbox, the subject line blank. I hesitated before clicking, then opened it, fingers tense on the mouse. Inside was a short note and an attachment. You thought you knew everything, but I've barely started. I opened the attachment, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was a video. The footage was grainy, shot from a shaky handheld camera, but I recognized the scene immediately. It was our bedroom. Sarah was standing in the doorway, talking to someone off camera in a low, intimate voice. She was dressed in a way I'd never seen before, more provocative, her tone playful. My stomach twisted as the camera panned to reveal a man's silhouette. But it wasn't just any man. It was me. Or rather, someone who looked like me. He had the same build, wore my clothes, even had my posture. The resemblance was terrifyingly precise. Sarah walked over to him, laughing as she put her arms around his neck, murmuring things that felt like a knife twisting in my gut. As the two of them moved toward the bed, I slammed the laptop shut, while rising in my throat. This wasn't just an affair. This was something more sinister, something orchestrated, planned. She'd found someone to impersonate me. But for what purpose? Was this video some twisted attempt to break me down, to destroy my sanity? Then it hit me. Sarah wasn't just trying to hurt me emotionally. She was setting me up. She was creating a reality where I would become the villain. I reopened the video, hands trembling, forcing myself to watch it to the end. And that's when I saw it. Just as they finished, Sarah leaned over the side of the bed, speaking directly into the camera. "See," she whispered, her eyes gleaming with a sick satisfaction. "If anything happens to me, they'll believe it was him." I froze, the horror of her words slamming into me like a freight train. This was evidence. She was creating a fake record to implicate me in a crime. She wanted it to look like I'd done something to her, that I was some kind of deranged husband she needed to escape from. She was setting the stage for her disappearance, one that would point every investigator, every friend, and every family member straight to me. My mind raced. If I took this to the police, they might see it as nothing more than a strange affair or a weird attempt at revenge. But once she vanished, this video would resurface, and the narrative she'd built would be bulletproof. There would be no way to prove I hadn't harmed her, no alibi strong enough to counter the damning evidence she'd carefully fabricated. I sat there, breathing hard, my hands cold as I clenched them into fists. She was playing a game I hadn't even known we were in, and she was winning. Just then, another email notification popped up. My stomach dropped as I opened it. Another message from the unknown number. "Better keep quiet. If you try to stop me, I'll make sure everyone believes it was you." I realized with chilling clarity that Sarah hadn't just outsmarted me. She'd completely trapped me. If I made one wrong move, if I went to the police or even tried to find her, this carefully constructed illusion would fall into place. She'd vanish, leaving me with the fallout of her sinister plot. Every piece she'd set up, the secrecy, the hidden bank withdrawals, the footage with my double, all of it pointed to one outcome. Me, behind bars, while she walked away free. I knew what I had to do. I had to go off the grid, to outsmart her in a game she thought she'd already won. But as I sat there, staring into the darkness, I wondered if I was already too late. The first step was to disappear, or at least make it look that way. I left my phone on the bedside table, fully charged and buzzing with messages I wasn't going to answer. I deleted all my social media accounts, cleared my online history, and made sure my finances were secure in a hidden account only I could access. Then I packed a single bag with only the essentials. I couldn't afford to leave any trail she could trace. The following morning, before the sun had even risen, I left the house quietly, slipping into the cold, early morning air. My car was parked at the end of the street, a few blocks away to avoid attracting attention. I drove in silence, the city lights slowly fading in my rearview mirror. I headed for an old cabin my father had left me years ago, nestled in the thick woods about 50 miles outside the city. It was a place few people knew about, and I'd hardly been there myself. It would give me the isolation I needed to figure out my next move. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever, but I needed time, space to think, and a way to keep an eye on her. Every mile brought me closer to a sense of calm, like I was peeling away from the life Sarah had tried to trap me in. The cabin was in worse shape than I remembered, and the air inside smelled faintly of mold and wood smoke. It was dark and cold, but that suited me. I set up my laptop, connected to a discreet VPN, and started digging into everything I'd managed to pull from her cloud. But as I reviewed the files again, it became clear that I was still missing something, some crucial piece of information that would explain why she was going to such extremes. Then, my screen flashed with a new email notification. Another message from that same unknown email account. Surprised you're still standing? You're more resilient than I gave you credit for. I felt a surge of anger at the taunt, my hands clenching as I read the words. She wanted me to react, to lash out, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. I had to be smart, patient, no matter how much rage boiled beneath the surface. A second email followed immediately after. You think you've got everything figured out. You've got no idea what I'm capable of. Attached was another video. My stomach twisted as I clicked on it, the familiar sense of dread creeping over me. The video showed our house, my empty bedroom, the sheets rumpled just as I'd left them, but with one terrifying difference. The bed was smeared with what looked like blood. The camera panned down slowly, capturing red stains on the carpet, a horrifying trail leading toward the door. And then, a message appeared on the screen, written in that same thick, red substance. They'll believe it was you. The realization hit me like a slap. She was going to make it look like I'd killed her. This wasn't just about framing me for a minor crime or swindling money. She was setting me up for something much darker, something that could bury me forever. For a few seconds, the horror paralyzed me. But then the rage took over, sharpening my thoughts, igniting a determination I hadn't felt before. If she thought I'd fall into her trap, she was wrong. I'd spent enough time playing defense. It was time to take control. I started mapping out her moves, thinking like her, anticipating her steps. She would try to involve the police soon, presenting herself as the innocent party, painting me as the dangerous, jealous husband who'd lost control. She'd likely fake her own death or disappearance, carefully setting the stage to make it look like I'd been responsible. I realized I needed proof of her lies, solid evidence that could counter her scheme before she put it into motion. I scoured the files again, hoping for any trace of her planning. In one folder, I found a receipt for a burner phone she'd bought only weeks earlier, registered under an alias. This was how she'd been contacting her lover, sending me messages and building her case against me. But it was a start, enough to link her back to the messages that had tried to taunt and intimidate me. As I gathered the pieces of evidence, I formulated a plan. I needed leverage, something irrefutable that would flip her story on its head. I had to create a timeline, showing that while she'd been plotting, I'd been quietly preparing my own counterattack. The next morning, I ventured back to the edge of town, stopping by a small store to buy my own burner phone. It would keep me off the grid, ensuring she couldn't track my moves or intercept my calls. Then I made my way to the police station, but I didn't go in. Instead, I parked across the street and waited, knowing it was only a matter of time before she made her move. Hours passed, my nerves on edge, when finally, she appeared. She walked up the steps of the station, looking disheveled, eyes red, clutching a tissue in one hand. She had perfected the look of a grieving victim. She'd probably rehearsed it 100 times in the mirror. When she came out an hour later, I followed her, keeping my distance. She drove out of town and onto a side road, leading me to the abandoned house I'd followed her lover to before. This was where they'd been hiding, plotting, and building their web of lies. I parked a safe distance away, watching as she entered the house. This was it, the proof I needed, the chance to confront them both with everything I'd uncovered. My heart pounded as I approached, my hands steady as I prepared to walk into the final showdown. I knew one thing with certainty. After this, there would be no going back. I crept toward the abandoned house, adrenaline pounding through me as I approached. The place was quiet, shrouded in the eerie stillness of twilight. I slipped in through the side door, my footsteps silent as I moved down the darkened hallway. The floorboards creaked softly, but the sound was swallowed by the thick silence hanging over the place. I could hear voices coming from a room at the far end. Sarah's voice drifted through the hallway, low and calm, speaking with a conviction that made my skin crawl. Her lover responded with laughter, an arrogant, dismissive chuckle that grated on my nerves. I pressed myself against the wall just outside the room, listening as Sarah outlined the final steps of her plan. And the police bought every word of it. She was saying, her voice filled with smug satisfaction. They're watching him now. Just a few more days, and I'll be able to slip away without a trace. By the time they realize what happened, it'll be too late for him. Her lover laughed again. You're ruthless, you know that? Most people would feel guilty about setting someone up like this. Guilty? Sarah's tone was dripping with disdain. He brought this on himself. He wanted me to be his perfect wife, wanted me to fit into his little box. Well, now he's going to learn what it's like to lose everything. I could feel my blood boiling, but I forced myself to stay silent, listening to every word. This was the proof I needed. She wasn't just planning to ruin my life. She was enjoying it, savoring every moment of betrayal. Her lover's voice dropped, and I leaned closer, straining to hear. So what's next? After he's out of the picture, we leave the country, Sarah replied smoothly. I've got new passports, identities, bank accounts. Everything we need is already set up. And as for him, well, by the time he realizes he's been framed, we'll be long gone. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I had enough evidence now, but I wasn't here just to gather information. I was done playing her game, done letting her dictate the rules. It was time for the confrontation she'd been avoiding, and I wanted her to know that I'd seen through every last one of her lies. I stepped into the doorway, my presence casting a shadow over the room. They looked up, startled, the color draining from Sarah's face as she registered that I was standing there, watching her. You look surprised, I said, my voice cold and steady. Didn't expect to see me, did you? Sarah's lover jumped to his feet, but I held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. Sit down, I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. He hesitated, glancing at Sarah, but she was too stunned to react. Finally, she found her voice, though it was laced with barely concealed anger. What are you doing here? She demanded, trying to maintain her composure. You're not supposed to be here. Supposed to be where? I asked, stepping further into the room. Sitting at home, oblivious? Waiting for the police to come knocking? Waiting for you to pull the final string and destroy me? She forced a laugh, but it was hollow, without the confidence she usually had. You're overreacting. You're just paranoid, imagining things. Am I? I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen displaying the recording I just made of their conversation. I've heard enough, Sarah. Every last word. Your plans, the lies, the fake disappearance, the setup. All of it. Her face twisted, and for a brief second, I saw real panic flicker in her eyes. But she quickly masked it with defiance. So what now? You think you can just walk out of here with that? The police will believe me over you. You're already on their radar. You're the unhinged husband, the one with a history of anger. They'll see this as exactly what I want them to. Maybe, I said, moving closer until I was just a few feet from her. But I'm not the only one who's going down. This time, Sarah, there's no escaping. I've left copies of everything, videos, texts, records of every withdrawal you made from our accounts. If anything happens to me, if I even so much as disappear, every bit of your plan will go public. Her lover stood, looking at her with unease. Wait, Sarah, he said, his voice tight. You didn't tell me he had all this. What exactly is going on? She shot him a glare, frustration flashing across her face. Stay out of this. I told you I'd handle it. No, I don't think you will, I interrupted, crossing my arms. This little scheme of yours? It's over. You've got two choices. You can come clean and end this here, or we can drag it out and see just how much the authorities believe your story when I present everything I have. She took a step back, her eyes darting to the door, as though calculating her chances of escape. But I was between her and her exit, and her lover looked ready to bolt. Fine, she said finally, her voice barely more than a hiss. What do you want? Simple, I replied, keeping my gaze locked on her. You're going to confess. Everything. The police will have it on record. And then, you're going to disappear, quietly, without a trace. No funds, no lover, no plan. You're going to start over with nothing. Her eyes narrowed. but I could see the realization sinking in. She'd lost. There was no winning now, only damage control. And if I don't, she whispered, a last attempt at defiance. I smiled, cold and unyielding. Then I'll make sure everyone knows the real you, Sarah. You'll be trapped in a prison of your own making, every secret, every lie exposed. She stood there, a flicker of defeat in her eyes, as her lover took a step back, clearly realizing that he was now on the losing side of this game. As I left the room, I didn't look back. I'd won. But there was no victory here, only the hollow satisfaction of knowing that she'd been beaten at her own twisted game. And for the first time, I felt free. I walked away from that abandoned house, the night air thick with the weight of everything I'd just endured. My heart pounded, my mind reeling, but there was a strange calm settling over me. The twisted web Sarah had tried to weave around me was unraveling, and for the first time, I felt I could finally breathe again. The next morning, I met with my lawyer, a friend I trusted implicitly. I handed him all the evidence I'd gathered, texts, recordings, and documents from Sarah's secret accounts. Together, we reviewed every piece of her elaborate plot, making sure each detail was perfectly clear. If she tried to pull anything else, we'd be ready. He assured me that with everything I had, I could not only protect myself but also prevent her from manipulating any legal proceedings in her favor. With that taken care of, I knew it was time for the final step. I drove to the police station, carrying a folder full of carefully organized evidence. It was early enough that the station was relatively quiet, with just a few officers milling around. I approached the desk, introduced myself, and told the officer I needed to make a formal report. The sergeant who met me in the back room was no nonsense, and I laid everything out for him, recounting the months of deception, the attempts to frame me, and Sarah's plans to fake her disappearance. His face was stony as he listened, but his eyes occasionally flicked to the evidence, clearly surprised at the level of detail and planning in Sarah's scheme. "This is quite a story," he finally said, flipping through the folder. "But if this is true, then you've got yourself a strong case against her." "It's all there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm done being her scapegoat." He looked up, studying me for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll open an investigation. Given the extent of this evidence, I don't think you'll have to worry about her taking this any further. But be prepared. She won't go down quietly." I left the station feeling lighter than I had in months. I'd done everything I could to protect myself, everything I could to finally close the chapter on Sarah and her lies. As I drove away, I felt a strange kind of peace settling over me. I knew Sarah wouldn't disappear without a fight, but this time, she was the one who was cornered. Days passed, then weeks. I heard nothing from Sarah, no further threats, no more taunting emails. The police assured me that they were conducting a thorough investigation, and I began to hope that maybe, finally, she'd been forced to accept defeat. One evening, as I sat alone in the quiet of my living room, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer. "Hello?" I said cautiously. There was a pause, then a familiar voice, tired and worn. "It's me, Sarah." The sound of her voice sent a chill through me, but I kept my composure. "What do you want?" I asked coldly. She hesitated, her voice breaking slightly. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry. For everything." I laughed, the sound bitter and hollow. "Sorry? Now, after everything you put me through, you want to apologize?" "I know it doesn't change anything," she said quietly, "but I've lost everything now. And maybe that's exactly what I deserve." For a moment, I was silent, caught between anger and a strange, unexpected pity. She sounded broken, like a woman who had finally been forced to confront the mess she'd created. "What do you expect me to say?" I finally asked. "That I forgive you?" "No," she whispered, almost to herself. "I don't expect that. I wanted you to know that I never hated you. I hated myself, the life I chose, the things I couldn't fix. And I thought if I ran far enough, I'd escape it all. But I was wrong." The line went silent for a moment, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Goodbye." And then she was gone, the call ending with a soft click that left me staring at the screen. unsure of how to feel. I didn't know if her apology was real or just another layer of manipulation. But it didn't matter. I was done with her games, done with the toxicity and deceit. She was out of my life, and I intended to keep it that way. In the months that followed, I worked to rebuild what Sarah had tried to destroy. I threw myself into my work, into reconnecting with friends and family, slowly piecing my life back together. The house, once filled with memories of her betrayal, began to feel like my own space again. And with each day, the scars she'd left became a little less raw. One day, I received a final letter from the police. They'd officially closed their investigation into Sarah. She had fled the country, leaving everything behind, including her lover, who had apparently abandoned her once the authorities got involved. She was gone, a ghost of a past life, and I felt nothing but relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was free. Free from the lies, the manipulation, and the woman who'd nearly ruined me. As I stood on my front porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past slip away. Sarah was a memory now, a lesson I'd paid dearly to learn. And as I watched the fading light, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms, no longer bound by the shadows of what had once been.